Awesome. Thank you everyone for joining. I guess we could start, but maybe what we'll do is just give like a couple more minutes for everyone that's joining. And in the meantime, what I'll do is I will talk a little bit about who I am and what Listening House is. So my name is Taylor Holloway. I am a social impact designer and design justice practitioner based out of New Orleans. I'm trained as an architect and as an artist. And Public Design Agency is a multidisciplinary design studio that I founded that employs design-driven processes and civic engagement as a way to build a more equitable world. I am also a co-founder of the Design as Protest movement. And Listening House is the second largest project out of Public Design Agency. And it's a unique project that encourages healing in individuals and communities through the process of collective cultural reflection. Yay, DAP. That's awesome. Okay, let me go back to my next slide. So I have this quote here from Rebecca Walker because I think it ties directly to what I believe Listening House is about, which is our search for identity and belonging as human beings. So I'm just going to read a portion of this quote and then I'll talk a little more. From the specific laying out of a room to the adding of a porch or garden, from the placing of a favorite item of the deceased on his grave to the daily sweeping of the front yard, when these patterns are recognized, repeated, and revered, so are the makers and keepers of those patterns. And Listening House is a project that works to cultivate and preserve these patterns and these stories and these individuals in our own identities and in our identities and histories as people of culture and people of color in the United States. This project is also an effort to cultivate and preserve the connection between personal and historical narrative and physical place and physical object making by providing a way of transferring familial history in the US to places, towns, homes, land, and objects that represent who we are and who we've come from. I think that what the goal of Listening House is in a larger sense is one, to give the tools of object making and history preservation to all types of people. But I also think it is a kind of archive of developing ways that we utilize space, rituals, roles, objects of remembrance to better understand the stories of ourselves. Okay, the screen thing is crazy. Let me see. Okay, so what is happening? What do we know about property and land ownership in this country? We know that only 2% of Americans are from one place, and the rest of all of Americans are from continents. Historically, they have ties to other continents, or they actually know the story of their family's arrival and first point of entry to this country. We also know that the removal of Black and Brown and Indigenous people from their land in this country is systemic and historical and part of our history as America. From everything like redlining to foreclosures, to gentrification, to eviction, to the Trail of Tears, to the creation of Native American reservations, to urban revitalization. Every single part of these acts is part of removing power that is related to land ownership and community building through physical space. We also know that one man in the United States by the name of Ted Turner owns literally the equivalent of the same amount of land that every African American owns in this country. So I'll repeat that again. all of the land that we as collectively as African Americans own in this country is the same amount of land that Ted Turner owns. We also know in the 20th century that roughly 8 million acres of land owned by African Americans was lost by 6 million between 1950 and 1969. So from Reconstruction to 1969, Blacks lost 6 million acres of land in this country. And at the same time, how does this affect us? Other than not having land, other than not being Ted Turner, other than facing gentrification and facing redlining and kind of unearthing this history, especially the way we are in this year, we also know that this has a great effect on all of us, and not just those of us who identify as people of color or people of culture. It affects all of us in this country. I want to talk about some of the ways that it affects us. So while we focus on all types of forms of education in our schools, including mental health and physical health, something that we don't focus on is how all of that is tied to a knowledge of ourselves and an understanding of ourselves. According to Ancestry.com, 1/3 of Americans can't name all of their grandparents, maternal and paternal. We also know that the search for belonging and ancestry is profound because we as a species use stories and places as a way of quote earlier this week from an author on Being, which was culture is the transformation of our collective trauma. So when we think about why we develop different cultures, is because we develop ways of surviving and ways of connecting. And usually that is in opposition or in response to a sort of trauma or threat. So some of the images that are on here are speaking to this search for identity and this search for preserving identity. This middle image is a kind of calendar and formed in the late 19th century, and kind of took the place of what a lot of historical documentation was done during that time around ancestry, which was Bibles. Bibles held, especially for Black communities, held the place of knowing our family names and our family history. We also know that in this last century, the search for identity and community is kind of a pandemic in itself when we consider how much loneliness is actually an affect of deaths in our country, especially for elder populations. So Sarah M. Broom's The Yellow House book and Alex Wagner's Future Face book are both stories of women recollecting knowledge of themselves and their families and their identities. And while, you know, Sarah Broom's is very much rooted in this country, Alex Wagner's takes her all around the world. And then I want to talk about how connection and knowing ourselves and our family history can actually fight off things like loneliness and anxiety. Studies from Emory and Duke University have proven that knowing about yourself and your family can increase your positive moods. It can increase your self-esteem. It can increase your feelings of social connectedness and your perception of meaning in your life. When we understand our intergenerational self, we have the ability to oscillate towards higher self-control and higher self-esteem, which makes us more likely to achieve our goals. And while this work of ancestry and the connection of ancestry to physical place may not interest everyone who doesn't happen to be a professional in the built environment like myself, I think it's important to talk a little bit about why this matters to me. On the Black side of my family, I was never told as a child any stories of our family history, of how we got to California from Philadelphia, from Georgia, what my great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents were like. And it wasn't until I spent a Thanksgiving with my father's eldest cousin who kind of provided an alternative to what I had seen of my most immediate Black family, which was he had gone to college, he was still married, he was an active member of the Divine Nine and still is. He plays golf, he was a school administrator, all of these things that nobody else in my family, and especially not my father, had done or had shown me as part of our family's culture. And one of the things that my cousin Mickey told me was, you know, your great-grandfather and my grandfather built a house that your grandmother grew up in and my mother grew up in. And that house is in Eastman, Georgia, and it's the green house on the top left of the screen. And he also told me that I had a great aunt who was a welder who worked on Navy ships. And this was the first time that I had ever heard that prior to me, there were people in my family who were makers and builders and did things with their hands to affect the physical environment. So, and also this picture on the right is of my dad's side of my family. My dad's not pictured, but my grandma's pictured. She's the woman in the hat in the middle. My nanny is her name. And while the family home that her father built on the left in Georgia still exists, it doesn't belong to anybody in my family. And I think that is a story that many communities and individuals of color can identify with. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to our activity portion. So I started to compile this year a series of questions that to me represented some of the experiences that Black and brown people have in our country. So I'm going to read some of them because they're all, oh, I'm glad Ambar is enjoying this and Sabrina too. All of them have, and I've taken on family historian. It's a real job. Let's just say that. It's a full-time job being family historian. All of us have a version of these questions in our lives. And I would love to hear a version of this in the chat if you have a question that relates to how your life and your family's history has kind of played out. So some of the questions. What do we do, or what do you do when you have no generational wealth? What do you do when you have no family homestead? What do you do when your grandparents' home is sold? What do you do when you have no idea where the graves of your ancestors are located? What do you do when you were too young to advocate for saving your grandparents' belongings and heirlooms? What do you do when your family forecloses on the first home they ever owned? What do you do when your family left a racist South for a segregated, still racist North? What do you do when your grandmother could have purchased her home but instead rented it for 40 years? What do you do when the side of your family holding onto generational land is the side of your family that you are estranged from? And I welcome any of you to create a what do you do question for a situation in your life or a situation you've experienced. Because all of these came from my life and the friends, the Black and brown friends that I have and the things that they've experienced in their lives. And the answer is a lot of times we don't have answers. But I do think that all of us at Hindsight, no matter what our design background is or our training is, have the ability to start answering and providing answers for these questions, not just for ourselves, but also for society and for the practice of design of the built environment and the physical environment. I really do believe that. Okay. So Listening House is my version of trying to understand or trying to come up with responses to these questions. And there's many ways that we've done it before. We've taken photos. Photography is a huge part of documenting our history. All of these photos on the left are from Ellis Island. We create historical markers like the Harriet Tubman markers in Dorchester County in Maryland. If you haven't been to Dorchester County, Maryland, to the Harriet Tubman Museum, you need to go. We also know about historical quilts from the South, but also fabric and storytelling through Native American quilting and weaving. And throughout the world, we know that's a way of telling stories and preserving history. And it's even a bonus if you actually get to pass on those quilts and those fabrics and those wedding dresses and those baby dresses and those baby blankets. And then there are some more kind of modern ways of reinterpreting that, which is, can you design a structure or a home that gives and pays homage to cultural history in your family or in a culture that you serve through your work? And then also, can you tell these stories in a different way, like through comics or through the Paper Monuments Project, which was a project in New Orleans that reimagined the space of monuments of New Orleans and the South beyond racist monuments. So I think we're all aware of there's a few ways to try to answer these questions, but the application of answering these questions, not for ourselves through single objects, but through our work as urban designers, planners, architects, policymakers, is where I'd like Listening House to go. So this is a rendering of Listening House that I developed a couple of years ago. This is actually the kitchen in Listening House, which is, to me, and to maybe to some of us, the most sacred place in a home, because it's where the most deep conversations and greatest learning can happen, which is around food and in front of an iPad when you're trying to cook a meal and a recipe you've never done before. There's some deep self-learning that can happen there. And what Listening House as a kind of interactive museum and place for archival recovery and archival translation is, it's a space where you can search your own identities and translate it into whatever sort of art form makes the most sense to you and is most accessible to you. And I'll talk a little bit more in the next slides about the different processes and steps that I think can be part of that journey. I also want to talk about a little bit on this slide about how in Listening House you can kind of explore the interconnectedness of the resilience of communities of color through our histories, because we have to be resilient if we are people of color, but we can explore that and also connect that to the resilience of the built environment. Buildings are some of the longest standing and sculptures are some of the longest standing human creations that we have, and towns and cities and things beyond that are our longest inventions and creations. Okay. So for Listening House as a project, the tenets and principles of place-based storytelling for me are hearing and healing. Everything begins with listening. And this is an act that we are never completely professionalized or perfect at. It's something that we have to constantly develop. But from hearing, both within ourselves and from others, we have healing. There's also the principle of being and belonging. You have to, as a human being, understand who you are as a being in your body and who you are in physical space and how you belong both to yourself and both to your surroundings. And then when we move beyond ourselves, we have our connection between individuals and between our communities, whatever those communities happen to be, virtual, physical, spiritual, ethnic, whatever they happen to be, educational. And then lastly, we can really talk about place and provenance and how having a sense of provenance and a sense of ownership and pride for a place, whether it is your home or your body or your hometown or where you went to college or where you went to high school, those things matter. And then when we get to the process of actually enacting place-based storytelling and creating a Listening House archive, the steps are story, so listening, interpretation, which is understanding and healing, and then artifact, which is the transference from a story into an object, and then archive, which is how we take whatever we've created or whatever we've exhumed from ourselves and make sure it is saved and make sure it is kept for our own records and for the records of those in our lives, and also for the rest of the world. So in the next kind of 8 minutes, I'm just going to talk about the kind of trajectory of Listening House. So the very first Listening House conversation and workshop took place last year at the Black Communities Conference at UNC. If anybody was there, it was awesome. And what we did was we started by listening to Vanya's story. Vanya is a first-generation African-American, and her parents and grandparents are from the continent of Africa. And I asked Vanya a series of questions in a Zoom conversation last year and recorded her answers. And they were questions about her family, traveling back to Africa, where she is in her life now as a social worker, and how the trajectory of being connected to her parents and her grandparents and her great-grandparents affected who she is today. And then after participants heard an excerpt of Vanya's story, they were challenged with the task of interpreting her oral narrative into a sketch narrative and creating drawings that visualize the memorable moments from Vanya's story. It's going? Okay. So people started there, and then after we had kind of done the Listening House creation for Vanya, we began to work with each other, and individuals worked in small groups and interviewed each other, and they asked them simple questions like, tell me about yourself, what's your name, what brought you to the Black Communities Conference? And then we started to dig a little bit deeper into stories of their families. What about your personal or family history do you find most fascinating, most unique, or most memorable? And most people have at least one story or one fact or one thing that was told to them by someone that they'll never forget. And then we went a little bit deeper and we asked each other, do you have any stories about your grandparents or great-grandparents that are important or known throughout your family? So what are the stories that we tell ourselves? What are the stories that we tell our descendants? And then when we move from stories, we can move to rituals, rites of passage, and tradition. So the next question was, do you have any family traditions that have been passed down through generations of your family or that you have created yourself? So what came out of that was a series of notes and a series of drawings where people who were listening to their partner did that step of archival translation and interpretation and artifact creation. And this was done primarily with an adult audience and an academic audience because we were at a conference. After that, I started to think about how Listening House really needed to exist beyond drawing. And I wondered, what does it look like to actually create a Listening House? Still a way to record and archive through word and story, but something physical that we can easily have and is accessible to all ages and all populations. So I partnered with the Studio B crew, and last spring at the Be Light Artists of Color pop-up workshop, and Be Light is the youth and teen arm of Studio B, we hosted a Listening House workshop for young people. And all we said was, come make a physical archive of your family stories, genealogy, your history, out of wood and out of words. So all of the kids who came to the workshop were given prompts, but mostly because of their age, all I said was, any stories that you have about your family or about your parents that are important or special to you, how can we translate that onto this Listening House? So here's a little bit of information about Studio B. If you were planning on coming to New Orleans or have ever been to New Orleans, I hope you've been here, / I hope you come here, because Studio B is amazing and they just reopened too. So here are some of our Listening House archivalists and creators. And it started with literally wood that I whittled down and sanded down into houses, and then they were given all the tools they needed to decorate their houses and then capture their stories on them. So the little girl on the bottom right wrote about how much she loves her dad and how much she loves her grandparents. The little girl on the left wrote about how the house that belonged to her grandmother that was ruined by Hurricane Katrina still existed, and she knows what it looks like, and she's been there. The story by the young man on the top right was about his mom and how his mother is his greatest supporter and has always believed in him. And then something that I thought was also interesting is on the backside of the little girl on the left's listening house. So on the front side with the windows and the door, she talked about her grandmother's house. And on the back side, she said, an empty house can still be whole. This is unprompted, but that's her recollection of the home that belonged to her grandmother. So now we're coming to part 2. And returning to our question, or to my question rather, about what we can do as a group of practitioners and professionals in this space, I want us to kind of approach this with an interesting activity that I hope will work with Happen. But what I'd like everyone to do, and I'll provide this for those young to remember it, but is think about one of these questions, one of these 9 questions in the context of your practice. And then I'm going to pose a question to all of you, which is, how might we foster equitable development practices, historic preservation, and restitution and reparation for communities of color in our cities and country, thinking of those previous questions? So what we're going to do now is, for those of us who've used Miro or Mural, Concept Board is another format for doing that. And I'm going to provide a link in the chat to a concept board. And what you'll do is you'll pick a question from this slide, and you'll do a little bit of brainstorming and ideation on the concept board around how you could possibly address this question as a professional. So you'll use your knowledge and your experience to generate ideas for these items of equitable development, historic preservation, and restitution, and any other way that you also think could be applicable. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second. And I'm going to grab our link. And I'm going to put it in the chat. Let's hope this works. You never know in this virtual world. Okay, so there's the link in the chat. So when you click on this link, I'm not sure if it's going to make you create a concept board account or not. It might be really easy. Like, it might just be like email and name. It won't be long because I created one myself pretty quickly. And then Uriah's already in here. Michelle's already in here. Ambar's in here. It's going to take you over to the concept board for Listening House, for Listening House Matrix. I have to grant access. Okay, let me see. Settings. Okay, anyone with the link should be an editor. So let's try this link again. Guest access. I changed it. It says editor. Everyone on here is an editor according to that. Oh, okay, let me see. Board participants, editor. Maybe you have to create your account. Let me see, 1 second. Anyone will have access as editor. You might have to create your concept board account, which is like your name and email. And then you're not just a guest editor, but you're like a concept board member. Let me make sure everything is unlocked for you though, while I'm in here. Okay, are you guys able to click on things? Okay, I see somebody with a J has been able to copy one of the questions from the left. I'm just going to keep unpinning them so you can copy yours. So basically what you do is you'll pick one of the questions on the left from the assortment of colors. You'll drop it into one of the first left-hand columns. So there's two kind of tables, kind of like Connect Fours or whatever. Drop your question in the left column and then go through steps 2 through 7 responding. So I think it's Ambar, but someone's doing a great job. So they dropped question number 5, and the planning category that they're working in is transportation. And then after you answer on step 2 what planning category you're going to think about this question in, the next question for step 3 is who would be involved? Who are the participants and stakeholders? Are they government? Are they private? Are they community? Are they children? And then think about your short-term version of this. So I love tactical urbanism. I bet a lot of you do too. So what's a short-term way that we can use our expertise and knowledge to address one of these questions? And then think about a long-term way for step 5, a policy level way. And maybe it's something really pie in the sky, but that's okay. That's what this space is for. And then when you get to 6, think about what the biggest hurdle for your long-term solution is. What is the biggest thing that you face? And then in step 7, we've smashed your hurdle. What's your first step to making this happen? If you have any questions, can I explain what a homestead is? Yeah. So my interpretation of what a homestead is a place that you can go back to that is owned by your family. So, for example, my sister owns her house, and I consider her house a homestead because I know I can always go back there and be safe and be loved and can live there if I don't have a job, which is something that has happened. But for some people, a homestead might be a piece of land. A homestead might be your entire hometown. It's a place that you can return to and know that ownership and control is not in the air or threatened, if that makes sense. Great. I see a lot of people dropping in their first set of questions and starting to move across the row with their ideas and their answers. If you have more questions, please drop them in the chat. I can see them now because I've been using different tabs. But this is really just a space for ideation, just a space for considering what could be possible. And I'm going to give us until about, I'm in Central Time, so about 2:45, which is about 10 more minutes. I was going to try to play some music. Let me see if I can find something. So we have about 10 minutes to just work on our slides, or work on our ideas. Planning category is the category that you think a project idea can fit into. So yeah, if you think it's architectural, say architecture. If you think it's K through 12 education, say that. If you think it's transportation, if you think it's environmental justice, what sort of category of project would this fall into? So it's less about your background, but if they're the same, obviously that's totally cool too. Okay, these are very good questions, and they're good for me to know because now I have to make sure I'm doing a better job of clarifying that. Okay, Spotify doesn't want to behave today, so let's see what else I can find for us. us. I just heard this really cool remake by Tame Impala. I'll play for us. It might not be 10 minutes long, so I might have to play it twice, but I really like it. I can find it. Cool. And so for any of us, oh, trippy. For any of us who aren't in the board, you can kind of see what people are working on. It's not loading wonderfully, but you can kind of see what people are working on. Okay, 1 second. Check out the grid right now. Let's see what happened to our grid. Okay, I'm gonna try something crazy. I'm gonna try to delete that white kind of area thing and see if it'll open the grid back up for us. Unpin. Let me delete that. Ah, there we go. Okay. You should be able to see it now. Okay, so about 5 more minutes.
BBC Radio 1.
Thank you, Uriah. my gosh, that was perfect timing. About a minute left. And then also, of course, like if you're still working on your idea, that's okay. I'm not going to close the concept board. We'll keep it open. And I'm like, how do we bring people to be able to talk? And I don't know if I know that much about Hopin to be able to allow people to talk. I know it has something to do with like adding to the moderation. Oh, people can ask to share audio on the upper right corner.
There's a share an audio and video button at the top. Taylor, you can just, at the moderation panel, you can just approve them at the bottom of your screen there. Yeah.
Okay. Clicking that. Thank you for that. Okay. Does anybody want to talk about their idea? And it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm not expecting any of these to be perfect. But if you want to talk a little bit about your idea, ask to share your audio so we can hear a little bit about what you came up with and what are any of the ideas or questions you have about your idea. Okay, I clicked the moderation panel and I don't see it like popping up to show anybody asking to share audio. Let me see. Is there anybody who wants to share their audio? Maybe I'm like totally missing where it says that I can do that. Okay, let's try this. In the chat, do we have any? Oh, look, Emily wants to share. This Hopin thing is complicated. Let's see if it works.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Hi, Emily. Is this working?
Can you hear me? Okay,
yes.
Great. Hi, everyone. I look a little different than I did yesterday. It's been a rough day. For those of you who saw me moderating the keynote, I can just go back to the screen. I also thank you so much, Taylor, for this. This is an amazing exercise. It made me think so much. I picked the first question, which is, what do you do when you have no generational wealth, like myself and my family? So under the second bullet, second point, planning category, housing, or the built environment for that matter. For me, I thought that who's involved can be a combination of different parties. In the private sector, a bank, a lending institution. In the government sector, it can be the federal or local housing agency. And then lastly, the community. So yourself, people who are interested in housing.
Yeah.
In the question of short-term idea, I noted that it can be possibly gathering community members who are interested in homeownership and then offering financial services that can do several things. One, teaching people the process, helping those who may not be ready for whatever reason, but are still interested in understanding the process. And then thirdly, helping or supporting those who are in the process and kind of guiding them through that process. So, providing education and support. And then in the long term, for me, specifically thought that to instill a first homeownership program that's inclusive. I think that, I know that in New York, at least, our local government agency, HPD, does have a program like that, but there are there are still some barriers into that program. And of course, there's also the lack of availability, as we know in New York, because there's always a lack of housing here. But to think more inclusive and creating a program that's accessible for everyone, and that it's not scrutinized by the corporate sector, right? Because I think that while the federal government or the local agencies are offering services like this, there's still some scrutiny. There's still these boxes that you have to check for these lending institutions. And I work in affordable housing development, so I know what that looks like. And so for me, it can be frustrating to hear experiences that people have because of these barriers that are set up in place to actually deter people from doing this work or from getting this opportunity. And then I also posted here, this can also be, in a different kind of a different perspective or a different planning opportunity. It can also look like a collective effort. So a community group or a group of residents coming together to want to create a community land trust and take ownership of their property. And that's also been something that we've seen not only in New York, but across the country. For 6, the biggest hurdle, again, I think it goes really similarly to what I've noted earlier, but some of the discrimination, institutionalized discrimination from the banking institutions, the lending institutions, income gap, inequality, the impact of redlining, all of these systems in place that have been purposely put in place to block people of color from brown and black people from being able to have generational wealth. And I think if I had a magic wand, it would really be to make the federal government or the local housing agency be the guarantor on someone's first mortgage. I mean, if someone was to default, the government will come in and take that guarantor position, and it is not on the shoulders of people who for so many years have been marginalized and not with support. And we know that the federal government through history has done a lot to support other individuals. And so I think if I had the magic wand, that would be what I would decide.
I love that. It's radical.
Yes, it's radical.
It.
Sorry to anyone, I'm not running for any office because it probably wouldn't pass. But I mean, we saw this when there was white flight, right? It was just in a different form. But a lot of white families during, the 60s and 70s were provided with a lot of support. Whatever that may look like is a little different, but they were provided with a lot of support from the federal government and from lending institutions to create and to have generational wealth through the purchasing of a property. But that is not something that we have seen.
All you have to do is read Color of Law.
Exactly.
And we can all become experts. I mean, not, but you read Color of Law and you're like, got it. And I think, what you also identified early on is that who is involved, how do we address this? Like, who are the parties and institutions and individuals who can help support this? There are so many different things we can do to actually support homeownership in our communities of culture. And, one of them is redefining AMI, because AMI leaves out a whole bunch of people. In the area that I live, AMI leaves me out if I, am categorized as a single household earner. I'm not, but if I were, I'd be left out completely. So I think that you're right, that the ways of equipping people, there's a list, right? There's a list of ways that this could be addressed. That's great. I love your magic wand idea.
No, thank you. This is great. Thank you for hosting this great session.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to go? We have a couple minutes left, and I wanted to ask, if you're still in the board and you want to kind of stay connected with Listening House and what's happening, do me a favor. On your question or on the first column of your idea, put your name and your email, and that on your Post-it or whatever, put your name and your email. And that will help me be able to follow up with any of you if you're interested in following up. I was going to make a survey, but I ran out of time. Anybody else want to talk a little bit about their idea or bring up a question in our last 5 minutes? And if you don't want to share audio or whatever, you can also put your question in the chat, or any comments you have about the session or about Listening House. We have a few more minutes. Thanks, Uriah, for adding your contact info. Thank you, Amber, for adding yours, and Michelle. This is great. I really should have. What's next for Listening House? So my goal for 2020 and Listening House was a workshop every month. That didn't happen. So it's a workshop in December, an in-person workshop in New Orleans. For any of you who happen to be in New Orleans or Atlanta, come over. So an in-person workshop. But the next really iteration of Listening House is a mobile museum and archive and artifact creation vehicle. So what does it look like to be able to bring Listening House workshops and the archive of our artifacts all around and outdoors in a safe, socially distanced COVID world, when being inside museums is not necessarily highest on everybody's list of priorities, and shouldn't be, frankly. But we also know that museums and cultural institutions are facing some of the greatest barriers to, recovering from this, especially those that are Black-led and Brown-led. So Listening House becoming a new form of museum and art space workshop that's a little bit more sustainable because it is smaller and mobile. So what's next is a crowdfunding campaign and a grant funding campaign to trick out a truck to become the Listening House truck, to bring these workshops and this museum to our communities of color. So stay tuned. If I add you to my mailing list, you will be hearing about the crowdfunding campaign, which will launch in the future. I don't know how long it will be before it's up and running, but it'll be soon, probably on IOB or Kickstarter or something like that. Yeah, can't wait to come to NYC. It's been a minute since the last NOMA conference. Yeah, anybody else have any questions or ideas they want to share? If not, I guess we are done. And thank you, Uriah. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And yes, please feel free to wrap up in the concept board. And if you want to reach out to me, the last slide that I have is this one. Oops, not that one. Nope. Okay. Thank you all very much for being here. Email me, follow me on IG. I'm not very active on Twitter. It's too much for me. And check out my website if you want to email and talk more about Listening House. And thank you for being here today.